Welcome everyone to Our Whole Lives webinar series. My name is Amy Johnson. I'm the Minister for Sexuality, Education, and Justice at the United Church of Christ. With me today, I have Melanie Davis, Anil Oommen, and Cindy Lee Alves, which I'll turn it over to them in a moment to introduce themselves. We want to thank you all for being here this morning and our continuing effort to provide some connection and education for all of us during this time. Melanie?
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Quite a number of you are here today, about 110 have registered, so we are very excited by that number. While the topic today is gender, you can also ask questions if you have questions that you'd like Amy and me to answer about your OWL programming or any other questions that you have related to that. You can put those in the chat, in the question section, and Amy and I will address them either today or in a follow-up email that you'll get after the webinar.
Thanks, Melanie. Anil, will you introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, my name is Anil Oommen. I am an interim director at Pacific University and an Our Whole Lives facilitator for 14 years, so something like that. Thank you.
Cindy Lee?
Hi, my name is Cindy Lee Alves. My pronouns are they and she, or you can call me Cindy Lee. I am a sexologist and an OWL trainer for about 4 years.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Before we get started with our content, I just want to go over a few logistics. You'll see at the bottom of your screen that there's a chat box and a Q&A box. I'm going to ask you to please put any of your questions in that Q&A box. The chat we're going to reserve for some instructions Cindy Lee and Anil might have for you, or other things that you may need to talk about, though we ask you to please keep any side conversations to a very bare minimum so you can concentrate on the wonderful material that Cindy Lee and Anil have for us today. So again, if you have questions, please please look at the bottom of your screen for the Q&A box and click on that, type your questions in there, and Melanie and I will moderate that. All right, so without further ado, this space a little bit with a reading, and then we will go ahead and start the content for this. This is called Turning to One Another by Meg Wheatley. There is no power greater than a community discovering what it cares about. Ask, what's possible, not what's wrong. Keep asking. Notice what you care about. Many others share your dreams. Be brave enough to start a conversation that matters. Talk to people you know. Talk to people you don't know. Talk to people you never talk to. Be intrigued by the differences you hear and expect to be surprised. Treasure curiosity more than certainty. Invite in everybody who cares to work on what's possible. Acknowledge that everyone is an expert about something. Know that creative solutions come from new connections. Remember, you don't fear people whose story you know. Real listening always brings people closer together. Trust that meaningful conversations can change your world. Rely on human goodness. Stay together. All right, over to our presenters.
Thank you. I'm going to share the slides so we have some visuals to look at. Although looking at each other would have been great too. This is helpful for us to kind of stay on par, because I know for myself, I'm really, really passionate about that stuff, and I'm going to try to stay really focused and not get too tangential unless that's where we go, and then that's what spirit takes us. So yes, again, my name is Cindy Lee. Let's go move forward. I just want to remind folks, if folks are not familiar with Zoom, that there is an opportunity for us to have a teachable moment when we do virtual magic. You are able to edit your name, so you can rename yourself to a name that feels good for you, and you can also include your pronouns so that everyone knows how to address one another if and when, you know, somebody asks a question in the chat, I mean in the Q&A section, or if we're just having a chat. So I tried to put a visual to kind of show you. If you go into the participant box, you are able to see your name and click on more, and it'll give you the option to rename yourself. And as you can tell, a few of us, I think all of us, included our pronouns within our name just to kind of help one another, you know, address each other. I feel like someone has their hand raised. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. So that we can keep the chat clear. I don't want to miss any of your questions. I feel like there's a few folks with their hands raised. So again, this is just a helpful tool. If you go to participants, which is usually at the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to see the whole list of participants, and you can click on yourself so that you can rename yourself and include your pronouns. Oh, sorry. All right, well, this was a teachable moment anyway. There is no participant box for webinar function. I did not know that, so we learn something new every day. And now you know, if you ever have virtual meetings, that is an option for us to be inclusive in action. So thank you. Just a brief overview for today. We're gonna have some conversation. We already had some introductions. I wish I was able to get in touch with all of you, but there are an abundant amount of you. We have 73 folks in here. Good morning, good afternoon, hello. So we did our introductions, and we're basically going to have a refresher in terms of gender and have a conversation around how it aligns, or how this being inclusive aligns with our values. And we're going to have some fun conversations around creating identity safe spaces so that we can center our participants or our colleagues or our peers, because having knowledge around gender is helpful even outside of the OWL classroom. And then we'll have some time for some Q&A. Please feel free to ask questions, whether they are directly related to gender, or if they're like gender adjacent around sex and sexuality. That'll be helpful for you in terms of this work and just being inclusive overall. Is there anything you wanted to add before I move on? Anil?
Nothing for me. Thank you, Cindy.
Okay.
And just a hello to everyone from all across, wherever you're coming from.
Yes, exciting. The gift and the curse around technology, right, is that we can communicate from far and wide with one another despite not being able to be with each other in real life. All right, some visuals, right? If we have a conversation, well, at least in my experience of learning about gender, is initially, right, the foundation of us learning around gender was very binary, right? So when we say binary, we say that it really was male, female, boy, girl, man, woman. There wasn't a spectrum, at least for myself. I know in my experience with teaching young people, there's a little bit more variety in what I've been witnessing around binary thinking. But at the same time, it's still not uncommon, right? So if you look at this left image, it shows that gender is way less like the two icons that we usually see in restrooms, and more like diversity and different colors and shapes and patterns. And, you know, this is a visual, but it's basically saying that yes, it's not uncommon that folks identify in ways that are in alignment with the binary thinking. However, we must be open, right? Especially, similar to what C.B. Beale has said, to be a preemptive radical inclusion, right? So we have to speak to all of us and welcome and honor all of us as if all these varieties are in the room without making assumptions based on other folks' gender or gender, basing it on a gender presentation. If you look at the image to the right, you can see, again, similar to what I've been saying, because gender for a lot of us can be expansive, right? There are some folks that feel that gender can be limitless in that. So gender is more of a spectrum, it's more of a range of expression, and we'll do a refresher on what these terms mean and the differences between them. It's how you relate to yourself, right? Your gender is yours. Some folks say your gender is in your brain, and your own personal identity, right? And we get to have a conversation around the variety of language that exists and the language that will continue to exist and expand on. So again, gender is not just male or female, although that exists. It even exists biologically. I'm happy to share a resource that it goes beyond male and female. It's not defined by our body parts. It's not in alignment with sexual orientation. And you'll see us repeat this, right? Because it's helpful for us to learn in repetition. And it's not determined by chromosomes. Because in determining in these ways, we are leaving out a host of folks, and that's not how we move an owl, right? Any ads? We're good? Okay, I'm seeing you, so if you have no ads, just I'll see the unmute. All right, so for folks, we talked about pronouns a little. Here's another infographic to be a little bit more helpful in terms of visual learners around the different ways that we can talk about pronouns. PGP used to stand for, or at least in my experience, it used to stand for preferred gender pronouns. However, I've seen in my experience with the folks that I've worked with, they've moved, and I don't know if it's a regional thing. I'm on the East Coast, if that helps, but folks are now they still want to use PGP, but they are talking more around personal because, again, language is so important. There is an assumption that if we talk about our pronouns as a preference, that kind of feels for some folks that it's tied to a gender being a choice necessarily. And for some folks that feels not inclusive to the range of folks that exist around gender. So PGP, I still use it. I think it's still helpful. Some people are gonna say preferred and some people are gonna say personal. It's real similar to the work that we did around like yellow flag words. So that word may not be harmful to someone, but to someone else, they might prefer personal. I don't know if there are other opinions or schools of thought around that. Anything? All right. So if you take a look, it's just examples of how to use it. I know in my experience, there's been a lot of pushback around they, them, when there's tons of literature that include they, them in more than just the plural. But here are some examples if that's not something that is commonplace in your lived experience, in your systems, right, in your communities. And it takes practice. For a lot of us, I know when I was a young person, I did not learn about pronouns in that way. We talked about it in grammar and we moved on. It wasn't something that we really had incorporated in our introductions, but since then it has evolved into being able to honor and address people the way that they want to be addressed. Because sometimes, and we'll talk a little bit more as we move on, the way we gender people based on what our perception is of their expression may not always be accurate, right? There's assumptions based on how we see them and how our values are around gender and gender roles.
I would just want to add that it's really important to kind of just the reminder that you said that it takes practice, right? To get used to using different terminology. And I always kind of like to bring in, you know, when a person from another country comes to the US, for example, I've had friends who will use a different pronoun for me, then like I go by he. My pronouns are he, him, and they might call me she, but that's because they're unfamiliar in that territory, right? So it's a little abstract. So it takes practice to get used to the pronoun. So I always say be gentle with yourself, but also work on it. work on doing it in the way that the individual prefers, or not prefers, but in the way that the individual identifies. Thank you.
For sure. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I know for myself, it's still a work in progress for me in terms of the Spanish language, right? Because so much of Spanish and French and Italian, at least in my experience, is very gendered. But there have been ways, and I've learned through my young people and my colleagues around ways to be inclusive in this, right? And don't let the opportunity for mistakes stop you from practicing, because we all mess up at certain points, but it's how, what effort are we putting into to being inclusive for folks, regardless of whether or not we think someone is trans, for example. I know in a couple of my OWL trainings, people are like, oh, we don't talk about pronouns unless we have a trans young person. And I'm like, but we won't necessarily know that. So again, going back to preemptive radical inclusion, what would it look like to just make this commonplace, right? To make this just an opportunity for us to have a conversation. Some people use they and them across because they think gender neutrality is better than misgendering. But they and them can also be a misgender, right? Depending on, again, it's going back to that intent versus impact. So practice, if somebody corrects you, now knowing moving forward, apologize, keep it moving, because sometimes our defenses want us to be like, no, but I'm sorry, but I do really good and I donate to Glisten, right? Like, you don't have to do any of that, and that puts the onus on the person to take care of you for messing up. We all mess up. Give ourselves grace around that, and then, keep moving and keep finding ways to be inclusive and making this a common practice in your everyday life, especially when you're teaching OWL.
Cindy Lee, we have a question in the Q&A that I think would be good to just tackle right here, right now, when you're talking about PGPs, and that's, will you please make a distinction for hears and zeers, or explain a little bit about those?
In my experience there are a number of folks who use Z, Zeer, here. This is not an exhaustive list. There's plenty of other pronouns that exist that are being created by folks in the community, for example, in my experience, by our young people. And it's just honoring the pronouns they use, and also understanding that it's okay if you mess up, because sometimes these are brand new for us. So I don't want to give a direct answer, because I've seen people who are cisgender that use these pronouns. I've seen people who are trans that use these pronouns. I've seen people who are gender non-conforming, gender queer, because your pronouns are yours. I know in my experience when I was working with middle school and high school, and I was working in sexuality education around there, sometimes my young people change their pronouns throughout the day, right? And I affirm that. There's okay, I'm going to honor how you want to be addressed. They're trying to see what fits. That's developmentally appropriate. It's just now that we're including pronouns in the mix too, instead of, the other things that we've learned around development in terms of finding yourself and finding your individuality and your connection to your identities. I hope I answered that as best as I could. And I don't know if
Thank you.
Do you have another piece to that? Because that's me. I'm like, I just saw a brand new pronoun, I think 2 weeks ago, that I'm sure I'm not gonna get right, so I'm not even gonna say it, but I'm so glad that Zoom exists, because folks put their pronouns in the participants for me, so I can do it. And sometimes if we are still fumbling around pronouns, calling someone by their name works as well. Right? And incorporating, things like name tags to talk about pronouns so that you have those reminders are also helpful. And it also instills that culture that this is what we do. We honor each other's pronouns, we bring them up, and we have conversations around them.
The only thing I would add to that, and it's just to support what you're saying, is that it's about normalizing using pronouns in the way people want it to be used, and it's about expanding our sense of inclusivity. So constantly, and I feel like we don't necessarily have to understand as much as think about how we're being hospitable to the person that we are with, and to be able to see a connection with others. So how are we including them? How are we being hospitable? How are we normalizing? Those are the things that I would affirm.
Absolutely, thank you. And I want to mention that the organization that created this graphic and another graphic that I'm going to show you, the Trans Student Educational Resources, that's a great resource, with a caveat of I looked into the resource recently, and I think they might be updating their website because their website has taken down a lot of the resources that you'll see included in the website. But I've also noticed that they're Googleable because other folks have used these images, that it will show up. So if you, for example, think that this image is helpful, it is. I have seen it in Google Images, separate from the fact that TSER slides are, website is down. However, I'm happy to provide this image with resources after the fact if that's helpful too. All right, let's keep the party going. It's time for a refresher. Let's see, maybe we're familiar with this. I don't know when it started getting implemented, but I know it's been in my life for a couple of years. And I think it's a good helper. It's really helpful in terms of a foundation. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. I don't even think we have enough time in this webinar to cover some of the language that exists within the past 5 years, let alone, in general, like period. So thank you to CBBO for the modifications, but this is a model from Dr. Eli Green around the differences between sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. Let's keep it moving. So just a reminder, because I know, at least in my experience of doing training, sometimes folks see a grid and automatically think that we're looking from left to right. So we're like, oh, so females are women and they're feminine and they're heterosexual, and males are men and masculine and bisexual, although those exist, right? Those people exist, and they're wonderful, but we're really looking at this from a top down just to show the different options that exist. And again, not an exhaustive list. So if we look at it in columns rather than rows, it'll be helpful. I am an 80s baby, so hopefully we get this 90s reference. I'm putting, if you notice the difference, I'm covering sexual orientation because we want for it to be clear that in this webinar, we're talking about gender. And although a lot of this is part of our sexual identity, our overall identity, they're different because very often in my experience, they have been conflated to be like, oh, they all go together, right? So if someone is a cisgender woman, they clearly want to be heterosexual, right? Like that these are assumptions based on our values, right? Based on maybe what we have been experiencing in our life or, what we've been exposed to. Sure, but we're not going to talk about that. This is helpful for you to see. We're going to cover sexual orientation because we're not talking about that. It's important to know the differences between attraction and actual identity. And if there's questions at the end, we're happy to answer them. But for the, purpose of time and being focused and clear, we're going to focus on gender, which also means that assigned sex at birth is not going to be covered. Because again, very often assigned sex at birth is seen to be the same as gender, or completely in alignment with someone's gender, regardless, right? Going back to that binary thinking. When there are folks who are assigned female, male, or intersex that have an unlimited amount of gender identities that exist, similar to attractions. So take home message, they're all different. If you have questions around one or the other, if we have time towards the end, we're happy to answer them. We're focusing on gender, right? And our gender identity is our sense of self, right? In terms of our gender. Before it was in terms of our maleness, our femaleness, all of that, none of it, it's an identity that we have for ourselves. So if you look at the column under gender identity, for example, there are some examples that we may or may not be familiar with, like woman and man. I will say that there is a couple of words that have yellow flags that we'll talk about in a second. So transgender, or sometimes short for trans. Transsexual is a yellow, probably to red flag word. In my experience, folks within the community might still use it if they identify as a transsexual themselves, but common practice for us in terms of us as facilitators, in terms of us doing work within OWL, transsexual is a little bit more of an older term, and it can be seen as derogatory, especially if it's coming from people who are not within that community. Yeah, we're good. Genderqueer, I've seen genderqueer as a gender identity. I've also seen it as a gender expression. So again, just showing how language shifts, right? When it comes to third gender and two-spirit, that's also a yellow flag, with this caveat of those are specific to specific cultures and cultural identities. Particularly, for example, when we talk about two-spirit, those are folks that are from indigenous communities. So that's usually limited to folks of that experience. So because I like or appreciate indigenous culture does not mean I can identify as two-spirit. And in my experience, I don't know if other people have experiences separate or aside from that, but it's just usually shown here to give you some examples of what exists. And there's also non-binary, which people have different definitions around in terms of their own identities. Because I've also seen well, let's stick to gender identity before I expand. And then agender, which are sometimes folks who feel like they have no gender at all, or don't really align with what society feels gender is. And again, I give these very grayish definitions because it can be different for any particular person in terms of how they define it for themselves. But it's good to have this like foundational information. And then finally, for gender expression, that's that outward presentation. And we'll show you an image in a second. So a lot of factors, right? Similar, if you remember going back to the circles of sexuality, there are a lot of factors in play when we're talking about our own sexuality. So feminine and masculine can seem completely different depending on folks' perception of that in terms of how they feel feminine and masculine to be. A very simple example is, 40 or 50 years ago, feminine would have been, wearing a skirt, right? That would have been seen as feminine. However, if we look at folks who express themselves in quote unquote feminine ways currently, it ranges in what attire, right? How they adorn their body. It could be skirts, it could be pants, and it'll still be seen as feminine because it has changed over time. And that even differs depending on where we're talking about, right? Because I'm talking about my lived experience in the United States, that might be different somewhere else. It's feminine and masculine might wax and wane, right? And then there's also androgynous, which is usually folks who kind of blur the lines between what's considered masculine and feminine in terms of their expression, right? In terms of their outward appearance. Drag queen and drag king, in my experience, that's usually folks who do it for entertainment purposes or as part of their profession or part of their art. So drag queens will be, in my experience, usually cisgender men, although I'm sure there are a number of folks who are drag kings and queens regardless of their gender. Like expansiveness. And then drag kings are, you know, they're performing masculinity or whatever, like hyperbolic, right? Very exaggerated, or what they think is exaggerated around femininity and masculinity. Butch and femme has also been used as descriptors for, again, what we deem to be feminine or masculine outer appearance. And that will change depending on where we live and how it's defined. Because butch and femme has also been seen as gender expression markers, particularly in gay and lesbian communities, for example. And then gender non-conforming. And again, this is not a limited list, but gender non-conforming can be seen as folks who push against what society feels is masculine or feminine in terms of their attire or their outward appearance, and will describe themselves as such. Are there any pieces, any additional things, or we're good? Okay.
Cindy Lee, I don't know if you saw the chat. There was somebody who wanted to chime in that many people who identify as butch or femme consider them as identities and not just expressions.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely, especially if we're talking about, in my experience of certain communities, like queer communities, LGBTQ communities, that is seen as an identity, particularly around either their own gender identity or in alignment with, but not necessarily with, their sexual orientation. So again, this is not like a fixed set foundational list, right? This is not, oh, if it's in this column, then that's it, then that's all it's defined by. And we'll see that more and more. 5 years from now, when a gender conversation happens, I'm sure there's going to be new terms or new ways that we look at these, the ways that folks describe themselves in terms of their identity. So yes, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. I think we can all agree it's complicated.
Yeah. Right. And that's the beauty, right? Because we are complicated beings. I know for so many of us, I know myself, I want to put everything in these cute little neat boxes, right? Very Marie Kondo, but that's not how this works. And I think that's the beauty of it, right? Like that's proof of the abundance that exists, is that we can have these things that feel right for us, this language that works for us, and know that it could shift and it could be different for so many folks.
Beautifully put. Beautifully.
Yes.
I'll stop interrupting you now.
No, you're good. You're good. You picked the perfect times when I'm looking for the slide button. It's great. Yes. All right. So this is another helpful infographic, visual aid. Some of you may be familiar with it. I know folks who were trained for our curriculum, with myself as a facilitator and the people I co-facilitate with, we like to use this as an additional resource. Again, this is also from Trans Student Educational Resource, also not gonna be available on their website, but super Googleable. I don't know if that's a word, but it's a word now, right? Because language is a lot. And it'll be easily accessible, but we're happy to give this to you on the side. Some folks might find this helpful. Some folks might find this a little bit more complicated. But it gives a visual aid. Some folks might have seen the gender bread person. It's similar to that, except this one was made by young people, a lot of trans folks or queer folks, and folks that are in allyship. So it's centering the most system impacted when we're talking around gender identity and sexual orientation. So it talks a little bit about what we've already talked about in that first foundational model, but then it also gives visuals to show that it is way more expansive than just even within a spectrum, right? Because a spectrum, it kind of shows that there's 2 points, and this is kind of showing that it's way more expansive than that, and it can wax and wane. I've used the coloring page of this version, which is just a black and white version, and I've used it with my young people outside of OWL to talk about like how they're feeling in the day-to-day. And sometimes they'd feel, they'd fill out, for example, gender expression, and they'd color in that feminine arrow all the way to the top. Oh, and then maybe they'll color the masculine arrow halfway, right? And it can change and it can range, but it's just a helpful way to look at the fact that all of these pieces are separate, but all of them are within us in terms of our identity. Do we have questions around that?
Cindy Lee,
Mm-hmm.
there is a question, do the terms genderqueer and gender nonconforming essentially mean the same thing?
I'm gonna say no, because essentially they might be similar, but it really will depend. There might be folks that use one interchangeably with the other, but it depends on the person and how they use it. Some folks might use it as a general marker for like, these things are gender nonconforming things, or these characteristics. And some might take it as an identity for themselves, or an umbrella term for folks who are gender expansive, which I've seen a lot in like nonprofit. When they're talking about trans and trying to be inclusive of genders, they might say trans and gender nonconforming folks, or trans and non-binary folks. But there are also folks who use those terms to self-identify as fill in that blank, if that's helpful. And I don't know if there's anything else. But yes, keep the questions coming, please. We are excited to answer them. And I love the unicorn. So if you notice, it has these little icons, and the icons go with each piece. And I just want to show that gender expression is a dot, and it's all these dots that surround the unicorn to just emphasize that it's the outward appearance. And then we're not going to get too much into it, but if you look, there's 2 hearts for physical attraction and emotional attraction, because those can differ for folks, and there's opportunities that it won't. Alrighty.
Okay, great. Thank you, Cindy Lee. I'm going to focus a little bit here on the Our Whole Lives values and principles versus white supremacy culture. And what I'd like to do is just really kind of frame this within the context of the 3 R's of the Our Whole Lives values, which is respect, relationships, and responsibility. And then kind of juxtapose that with 13 indicators of white supremacy culture. So I'm just going to list those, and I want you to just kind of think about which ones might, I don't want to use the word resonate, but which ones do you see being maybe more present in your life at this moment, and then we'll talk a little bit more. So Our Whole Lives values that I'm framing this with come from the younger grades. So rights, respect, and excuse me, I have to, there's so many R's, respect, relationship, and responsibility. So those are the core values that kind of frame our work in our whole lives, as many of you know. And then this information that I'm getting is from Showing Up for Racial Justice and Surge. And so there are 13 markers of white supremacy culture that's listed there. The first one is perfectionism. And so I'll just mention, Cindy Lee earlier mentioned this idea of how we want things to be in neat boxes and keep it all tidy, and it's got to be, how do I get it right? So think about that in terms of white supremacy culture and this idea of, we got to get it right, we got to get it perfect. So perfectionism, sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, paternalism, either or thinking, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, individualism, progress is bigger and more, objectivity, and right to comfort. Now I'll share with you a website link later, because I don't want you to go there now because it's very interesting, right? So I'll share with you a website link later that that you can read, and it'll show not only the descriptions of each of these things, but like, for example, I'm going to just highlight for a minute the either or thinking, that things are either or, good or bad, male or female, right or wrong, us or against us, that kind of thing. And then in this description, they also have some anecdotes. So the anecdotes for the either or thinking would be, notice when people use either or language and push to come up with more than two alternatives. Notice when people are simplifying complex issues like gender, for example, right? So of course, our context here in this webinar is around gender and gender identity. And so gender identity in particular. So it's complicated, as Amy mentioned earlier, and as Cindy showed us through her presentation of the slides. So don't try to oversimplify something that's so complex, right? So, and then, notice when people are simplifying complex issues, particularly when the stakes seem high or an urgent decision needs to be made. Slow it down and encourage people to do a deeper analysis. When people are faced with an urgent decision, take a break and give people some breathing room to think creatively, avoid making decisions under extreme pressure. So this is sort of larger big picture concept and idea, right? So how do we bring it to our whole lives? And when we're talking about gender identity, how does that connect? How do we help keep it that we are complicated and complex people? And so we're not a this or a that. We're Anil Oommen, or we are, use our names for one thing, or to try to really understand that there's more to us than what we see, what a person could see. So I'll share that resource in the chat at the end. Again, Cindy Lee mentioned this. I have this graphic here that my body does not define my gender. So that's just sort of again, I'm a big picture person, so I'm trying to bring the big picture or the big rocks, the big ideas to you. And then we can work and adjust with that. Cindy, would you mind moving to the next slide? Thank you. So for me, here again is another big picture, is we're trying to create identity safe spaces. And when I think about identity safety, there's in the education world, I train teachers and educate teachers and educators. And in our world, there's a lot of conversation right now about culturally responsive teaching, or culturally responsive facilitating. We can use that for OWL, right? So for our OWL lives. So culturally responsive teaching or facilitating, I want you to think about it in this sense that when we're teaching, we're already being culturally responsive to the dominant culture, usually, right? So, and I'm making some broad assumptions here. So but I also see it. The dominant culture is what we're being responsive to. So in order to create an identity safe space, we have to look to the non-dominant identities in our whole lives group, or in our classroom, or in our webinar, or wherever we are, right? So we have to look to that. And so there are three big rocks that I like to use in thinking about creating identity safe spaces. And this comes from Parker Palmer, who's written the book, The Courage to Teach, which is a wonderful resource. Lots of beautiful, beautiful pieces there. It's a classic. But he has these three big rocks of what it means to create a space that is conducive to learning. And that, without saying, also means conducive to, or safe to all the identities that are present or that could be present. Not just that are there, but that could be there in some way, shape, or form. So these are the three things that he says, and he goes into much more depth than I'm going to here in our brief webinar. The first is boundaries. So, having clear boundaries We talk about this in our whole lives in the boundaries section for trainers, right? So it's really, boundaries are supposed to help enhance learning, they're not barriers. So if you're not creating an identity safe space, one real clear clue is if it becomes a barrier to someone in the group and they can't learn. So we as facilitators have to kind of do some inner work of like, what is it that we're doing? That, I mean, it's not always something we're doing, but I think we have to start there. What can we do to help create a more identity safe space? The second big rock that I like to, I call it the big rocks, my big rocks. So the boundaries is one that Parker Palmer mentions, and then openness. So this sense of openness means we don't always have to understand why somebody identifies the way they do. That's the way I interpret it. There's a lot more to being open, right? So, and people always ask me, well, how can you have boundaries and openness? Well, that's part of the paradox of life, right? So the boundaries help us to define the space that we're working in. And so that we don't go into all these, let's use the term rabbit holes, right? So we gotta stay in this space of gender identity right now. So, but I'm kind of pulling it back to think about this big picture. So boundaries, openness, and the third part, I love this one in particular, is hospitality. How are we inviting people into the space? How are we inviting our whole lives participants into the space in a way that they can engage and know that they're not going to be judged? So those are the big rocks of like really, and I think our whole lives values really helps us to really fit well with these pieces, right? They don't go counter to it. So these are things that can really help us, and the practice that we take to, and Cindy Lee mentioned this earlier, we're gonna make mistakes. And one of my students always said to me last year, fail fast. The faster you fail, the better you become, right? And we're not striving for perfection. We're striving to be responsive to the people in front of us and in a human way. And so I think it's important to fail fast. Don't be afraid. I mean, I use myself as an example, usually in trainings. I didn't do this work, or I don't do this work because I know that I got it right. I do this work because I know that it's the right thing to do. And then you engage and you make mistakes. And I can give you lots of examples of mistakes that I made, especially around gender identity, right in the middle of trainings. And what the participants are looking for is, how do you respond? It's not about whether you got it right or wrong. I mean, obviously you don't want to hurt people or harm people, but you want to be able to respond to people who are calling you. And I don't really think of it necessarily as being called out, but being called in. I'm being called in to participate in creating a safe space for them, because maybe I had a blinder to what to what could have made it more safe for them. Okay, that's it for me.
All right, so now we have about 11